Hi, welcome back to this briefing on the basics of K-12 public education in the United States. The briefing makes 4 key points: that the purpose of public education is contested, that the system is highly decentralized, how well our schools are doing depends on who you ask, and improving our schools is a serious management challenge. When you finish watching this series of videos, you should have a better understanding of why the system works the way it does and be better able to anticipate how new change efforts might unfold. The briefing is organized in 4 parts, each posted as a separate recording. This is part 3, how well our schools are doing depends on who you ask. Take a few seconds to look at the headlines pasted on this slide. Together, they say a lot about the results our education system is producing, especially that it is another contested question that's harder to nail down than one might think, and depends on what outcomes are prioritized and what context they are viewed in. Could all of these things possibly be true at the same time? It is particularly difficult in this portion of the briefing not to bring in my own interpretation, but I'll try to make 4 points that I believe are pretty well supported. First, access and attainment have continued to grow. There's been some progress improving student achievement, but it's incremental, and particularly so when considering increases in spending and many interventions that have been attempted. Racial and socioeconomic disparities remain stark and persistent, and there's a big gap between what the system is promising and what it is producing. The 20th century trend of more schooling for more people continues in the 21st. The national graduation rate hit an all-time high of 82.3% last year and is up more than 10% since the turn of the century. Turning to college enrollment, the total undergraduate enrollment in degree-granting post-secondary institutions increased 31% from 13.2 million in 2000 to 17.3 million in 2014. And degree attainment. According to the Pew Research Center, today's young adults are the best educated generation in history. 34% of 25 to 32-year-old millennials have a bachelor's degree or more, compared with 25% of Gen Xers, and going back 2 generations, 13% of the silent generation, those born between 1925 and 1945, comparing these groups when they were the same age. Finally, about 10% more children are participating in pre-K and early childhood programs since 1990. Though these percentages have not changed much in recent years, that increase has flattened out and still significantly lag behind other nations in the OECD. In their public education primer, Kober and Usher interpret the tables on this slide as follows. Since the early 1970s, reading and math achievement has increased for younger students, but has not improved significantly for high school students, according to long-term data from the National Assessment of Educational Progress. I chose these charts because they look similar to most that I've seen in my career related to student achievement. But what to make of this flat and or maybe incrementally improving trajectory? I suggest doing your own scan of articles and op-eds to see a variety of more or less generous interpretations of this data, as well as other achievement results, including those that compare the US system often unfavorably to other countries. For example, in 2012, 29 countries outperformed the US on the PISA in math and 22 in science. While there actually are some reasonable arguments for a more positive interpretation, it's safe to say, in any case, that improvement has not been transformational or dramatic. This despite increases in spending. From 2002 to 2012, current expenditures per student increased by about 5% in constant dollars to $620 billion. And this doesn't account also for the significant investments that many private philanthropies have made in trying to help school districts improve their outcomes. Finally, I want to just mention here that it's important to keep in mind that student test scores are just one important outcome measure. But at least from my experience, looking at other indicators, we would see similar patterns, what I would characterize as incremental progress and pockets of success. It is impossible to understand the way education policy has evolved in our country and continues to be contested without considering the deep impacts of race and class. The struggle of Black citizens and other communities of color for equal opportunity, the resistance of many whites, continued concentrations of poverty and racial isolation, and on a more positive note, a broad-based effort to close what is commonly referred to as the racial achievement gap in recent decades, albeit through a variety of different and competing strategies, are all part of the history and policy context of our K-12 system. Latino and Black students have made the biggest gains in graduation rates and have been key drivers in raising the rate nationally. But persistent disparities in outcomes exist across virtually every measure, including attainment, test scores, graduation rates, attendance, suspensions, GPAs, and advanced course completion. This is true in the context of changing demographics. Since 2014, the majority of students attending public schools in the United States are Latino, African American, Asian, or American Indian. At the same time, there has been an increase in the percent of students from low-income families. The percent of students qualifying for a free or reduced price lunch subsidy has increased from 38% in 2000 to 51% in 2013. It's important to note that this is not the same as the percent of students living in poverty. That number is closer to 20%. But the free and reduced price lunch number does give us a reasonable proxy for the percent of students living in low-income households or attending schools and districts where the vast majority of students are low income to the point where the district has extended this subsidy to all students. In any case, it gives us a clear sense of the direction that this percent has been moving. Further demonstrating an ongoing demographic shift is the fact that the number of students who are English language learners has climbed by more than 50% over the past decade, to the point where 1 in 10 public school students is an English language learner, a student whose first language is not English. Of course, these numbers that we've talked through on this slide are very different depending on what state and district you are in, once again contributing to the challenge of developing and aligning policy solutions. Schools remain highly segregated, with a trend toward resegregation since the early 90s, according to observers like Orfield and Lee. In a piece in the New York Times Magazine, which I highly recommend, journalist Nicole Hannah-Jones cites the United States Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights when she writes that, quote, schools with large numbers of Black and Latino kids are less likely to have experienced teachers, advanced courses, instructional materials, and adequate facilities. She adds, most Black and Latino students today are segregated by both race and class. Regardless of how one views the performance of the system overall, and whether one chooses to focus on progress that has been made or urgent challenges at hand, it seems fair to at least view the outcomes in relation to the goals it's communicating to its own stakeholders. In this light, there is a sizable gap between the vision of all students graduating high school, college, and career ready, and various metrics for measuring this particular outcome. Using test results from the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or NAEP, you can see on this slide that just about 39% of students are scoring at college-ready levels in math, and 38% are scoring at what's considered a college-ready benchmark in reading. The ACT and SAT have also made efforts to correlate score thresholds with performance in college. This slide shows on the right graphic that for the ACT, only 28% of students who took the test in 2015 met college-ready benchmarks in each of the four subject areas. Looking at this question from a different angle, not related to standardized tests, the Education Trust looked at high school transcripts and found that, according to their analysis, just 47% of American high school graduates completed what they would consider to be a college or a career-ready course of study. So, setting aside whether one agrees that college readiness for all students is the right target, if it is the target that schools are striving for, it appears there is quite a long way to go. This concludes the third section of our briefing. Take a few minutes to focus on your own perspective of how well our schools are working. What outcome or outcomes do you think are most important? How would you summarize the performance of the system in just a few words?